Hello everyone, I hope you're all keeping well, healthy and happy. In this video, I'm going to talk about the education system. How did it become this behemoth, this tool of indoctrination? What happened to it? Well, the answer to all of these questions is that nothing happened to it. Okay? It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't understand. If you want to get a good handle on it, I would strongly recommend that you read John Taylor Gatto's book, Weapons of Mass Instruction. Okay? In that book, he explains how the state education system came to exist and its original function and current function, which are the same. What happened was in the late 1800s, at the tail end of the French Revolution, which produced socialism and then produced communism as a result of the teachings of people like Francois Fourier, who I've talked about, people like Babeuf, who I've talked about, and people like Alphonse Constant or Eliphas Lévy. And these people gave rise later to the likes of Marx and Engels, who started the communist revolution in Russia, and later, of course, to the Bolsheviks. Now, whilst this French Revolution was going on, the Industrial Revolution was also going full bore, okay? And rural populations were moving into the cities to find work in factories and cotton mills. And what this led to was the creation of the working class, because before then, most people were agrarian farmers, right? It was an agrarian society. Now, these industrialists, politicians, and bankers realized very, very quickly that they would need more compliant and productive workers to increase their productivity. So what they started doing was looking at political philosophies and systems that could be used to create said workers across the world, right? They started looking around. Then they started targeting the children of the working class as an experiment to train and create the most productive workers, because they knew that the parents would very quickly accept their proposals. Why would they do that? Well, because the children needed somewhere to go while the parents were working. Again, it's no different from the way it is today, right? Kids get sent into daycare, kids get sent into schools because their parents need to work and the children need to be in some way, shape or form supervised. At least that's what the parents believe. Now, to achieve this goal of creating the perfect mindless worker drone, they turned to a place called Prussia. Okay? And in Prussia, there was already a public education system to produce obedient soldiers. So they tweaked this system so that they could produce obedient slaves. It's a brilliant method of creating slaves to the political, banking, and business classes, the corporate oligarchs. Okay? This is what very quickly became apparent to the people that were running the education system, the proponents of the education system, right? Now, the Prussian education system was established in Prussia in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and was adopted by every American K-12 public school, as well as major universities. Okay? And that happened in the late 18th century, into the early 19th century, and it indoctrinated all the children into the service of nation building. Okay? Teaching children and teaching young adults blind obedience to authority. right? That's very important. That's the whole point. If you make children compliant, if you make them believe that such a thing as authority exists, unchallenged authority, by the way, not true authority. A true authority, as I outlined before, is someone who has expertise in a particular field. Okay? But this blind obedience to perceived persons of authority is what is dangerous. And what schools also did in Prussia was to reinforce class and racial prejudice. Now, do I have to go into how this is still happening today? I hope not. Okay? Because if you take a look at this communist doctrine, which is being taught in schools the world over practically, especially in Western civilization, what are kids being taught? They're being taught all this nonsense, this garbage, with revised so-called history, right, about how awful and terrible white people are. Or how lazy and indolent by default black people are. Right? How do they do that with black people? Well, they create an entire victim class. They establish a narrative based on that. Okay? And they enforce and reinforce this class separation and segregation via their indoctrination. Instead of helping children, teaching children to become individuals, they collectivize them. Okay? Into their own special groups. It's very, very dangerous stuff. But that was the aim of the public education system from its inception. That's the point I'm trying to get across here. This is what these factory owners and industrialists and bankers and politicians knew, right? This system, you might even call it factory farming, actually. Human beings are farmed, and schools are very much live up to their name, actually. Right? Like a school of fish. Everyone just goes where they're told to go. Everyone just follows this perceived authority figure. Right? In the classroom, that's the teacher. In the school, it's the head teacher. And the number of times that people in these positions abuse their power and authority is staggering, and yet still people don't see it. So who were these people that brought in this education system? Who were these paragons in society? And I use that term laughingly, right? Who were they? Well, early American adopters included the first president of Johns Hopkins, a man called John Dewey. Now that's spelled D-E-W-E-Y. I would strongly recommend that you do some research on this guy, right? Because what he did was to advocate for Americans to support the Chinese transition to communism. This guy was an admitted communist, right? He wanted Americans to support China changing over to a communist country. That's pretty blatant, right? Another guy who championed this, who was an early adopter of this education system, was Daniel Coit Gilman. Now, here's the interesting thing about Gilman, right? He set up the General Education Board. But the General Education Board was later renamed the Rockefeller Foundation. Does that give you an insight into what is going on yet? Right? And what has been going on? Another guy who played a pivotal role was James McKeen Cattell of the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia University. He's had some very, very interesting ties into the same socialist framework, if you will, that was brought in to create this education system of slavery. And you also had James Earl Russell, who taught at the New York College for the training of teachers. Okay? And he set that up, in fact, right? The College for the Training of Teachers. That's laughable. Teachers? That wasn't what they were designed to be. They weren't designed to teach, as in the old methods, perhaps, that we might find in Greek education, where Socrates or Aristotle would hold these public gatherings so that people could truly learn via logic and reason. Okay? They weren't creating teachers out of this. They were creating willing slaves who would enslave other slaves. And it's particularly insidious because they were doing it to children. Now, that's America. But guess what? The French and British education systems were based on the American system. This is something that a lot of British people and French people and European people do not know. Okay? We took that same idea that was based on the Prussian system and adopted it in the 1880s. Now, here's another thing. The basic foundations of the Prussian primary education system were laid out by a guy called Frederick the Great. He was an emperor or king or what have you of Prussia, right? Again, this is why he rolled out this system of obedient soldiers being created through the school system, right? Well, it turns out that Frederick the Great was an icon of the Nazis. They loved him. They absolutely loved him, right? And the Nazis also took a lot of their ideas from the Prussian system. Okay? So that gives you some sense of how dangerous this thing was. And guess what? The communist Soviet Union adopted the same ideas. So, make no mistake, the biggest mass murdering ideologies on the face of the earth thought this was a good idea. And you can see the results from history, right? Now, in John Gatto's other book, called Dumbing Us Down, he asserts that schools do the following things to children. They confuse the students, presenting an incoherent ensemble of information that the child needs to memorize in order to stay in school. Apart from the tests and trials, this programming, Gatto asserts, is similar to television. It fills almost all the free time of children. They see and hear something only to forget it again, right? And they're told that the best thing they can do is to memorize and then parrot out what they've just memorized. This is what we call learning by rote. It's insane. Now, it is true that memory obviously is a faculty which is very useful, right? And it does help in matters of critical thinking. But it's not the only factor in it, okay? And this is part of the reason why kids, when they come out of these schools and colleges and universities, can't think critically. But we'll get into more of that. It also teaches them to accept their class affiliation, as we talked about before, right? Again, because it's based on the Prussian model, this is what it does. It makes them indifferent. It makes them emotionally dependent, and it makes them intellectually dependent, which is not good news. It babies them in a way that is really, really harmful to the children. And it also teaches them a kind of self-defense which is not a true self-confidence, I should say, self-defense. Self-defense is a necessity in places like this, schools that have become like prisons, right? It teaches them a kind of self-confidence that requires constant confirmation by experts or so-called experts. Okay, this is a form of provisional self-esteem. It's not true self-esteem. It's not true self-confidence. Okay, it's false, and it's not based on merit. It's based on how well you can parrot out the indoctrination which you have received. And schools make it clear to the students. This is one of the worst parts of it. But again, there's a reason why this was used. They make it clear to the students that they cannot hide, that they are always being supervised. All the time. They can't escape it. Okay? It is literally like a prison system. Kids are treated like criminals that haven't committed any crimes, right? This is insane. But this is the education system. It's designed to produce slaves, obedient slaves. I cannot stress that enough. Schools are nothing more than indoctrination camps, and they always have been, especially public schools. And it's something to think about that they use the same models adopted by the Nazis and the communists in the Soviet Union and in China. Okay? It's the same fascist, socialist model that came out of the French Revolution. People oftentimes, by the way, get confused about that. They don't realize that fascism actually falls on the left of the political spectrum. Right? It falls on the left of the political spectrum. It's not on the right. Now, you might look at me if you're new to these ideas and say to me, how can that be? We were taught in these very same schools that fascism is obviously something that emanates from the far right. You are completely mistaken if you believe that. But I understand why you might believe it, and I'll tell you why you might believe it. Here's the reason for it. It goes back to Theodor Adorno. Okay? Who was Adorno? Well, he was a member of the Frankfurt School. These cultural Marxists that I've so often spoken about. He redefined the meaning of the word fascism by developing something called the F scale. And he did this in the 1950s. Okay, just after the Second World War. The 10 questions in the F scale had nothing to do with determining whether someone was actually a fascist or not. But instead, the F scale was used as a flawed psychometric test. It was pseudoscience, psychobabble, right? None of it holds true in a real scientific sense. And in fact, it's been debunked so many times in modern times. And yet, this F scale is what people go by in the education systems. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, it's just batshit crazy. And what it was actually designed to do, this F scale, was to diagnose sexual repression and Puritanism. That's what Adorno had designed it to actually do. And if you were sexually repressed, according to Adorno, right, and you weren't a sexual liberal, which all these nutters on the left believed is a great thing, right, then you were branded as a fascist. I mean, you couldn't make this up. This is just madness, right? But what is fascism in reality? What is its true definition? Well, it means to have centralized state power. Okay, if you've learned anything about anything, you'll know this, right? To have centralized state power and control is to have a fascist system. Okay? But the F scale stripped the word fascism from its ideological roots and made it meaningless. Okay, that's what they did. And then along came Herbert Marcuse, ever so slightly later, and he was another member of the Frankfurt School, who taught at the University of San Diego. And he published a work called Repressive Tolerance in 1965. Now, the central premise of that publication was that the left, i.e. the socialists and the communists, don't have to be tolerant of those on the right, who they purposefully branded as intolerant. They used Adorno's F-scale to brand them as fascists. Okay? Why did they do that, you might wonder? Despite the fact that the majority of mass murdering regimes have been vehemently on the left, the hard left, the radical left, right? Well, his basic idea was that if the left could frame their political opponents as intolerant, they could ignore their rights. Okay? He even advocated using violence as a means to silence opposing views. That's part of the reason why you see the left today doing the same thing. Okay? Because Marcuse believed very strongly in the very ideals that were spawned from the French Revolution, which was very violent and bloody, right? That same socialist revolution contributed to socialist thought later on, including in the Frankfurt School, including with Gramsci and Marcuse and Adorno and others, right? And it produced this damaged, destructive, nihilistic system that we're all living under today. So, Marcuse excused violence on the left by calling it a social good. Okay? He was entirely opposed to the idea of free speech, which is a central principle of the American Constitution and a foundational element of natural rights, according to natural law. Okay? And by painting his opponents as fascists, he was able to justify the left's own behavior all throughout history. Here's what's even more bizarre. These so-called anti-fascists on the left, right? The socialists and the communists, actually adopted Martin Heidegger's philosophies. Right? For those of you that know who Heidegger is, you'll be laughing, right? Heidegger was a member of the Nazi Party. He was a member of the Nazi Party, and he was an enemy of technological capitalism. He was also an anti-humanist and hated America precisely because of its constitution. All of these people have hated the American Constitution, the notion of natural rights and the notion of natural law. They've all despised them because they promote and champion the truth in an objective sense and individualism. Individualism that benefits the whole, right? But these are the people who have shaped public education in the West for the last 160 years. And in case you're wondering why the early industrialists and bankers and these other think tanks were in favor of this system, you have to remember that they were in favor also of state-directed capitalism, which is a very close approximation of fascism. Okay? And they were all very heavily influenced by the ideological belief systems which spawned socialism and communism, which came out of the French Revolution. The ideas of Fourier, Francois Fourier, who I've spoken about a lot, and Francois Babeuf, and also Eliphas Levi, or Alphonse Constant as he was known, a student of Fourier's. And you also find that their direct ideological descendants, Marx and Engels, and in fact at the end of the day Hitler himself, were all of the same bent. They were just different branches of the same social theories. Okay? They were different branches of social engineering theories. That's what people don't get. And the public education system that was first instituted in Prussia was based on those same ideals, which is why the socialists and the communists adopted fascism to its extreme. Okay, they adopted the same fascist education system that benefited the Prussian military to create obedient slaves, to create a brand new slave class. Okay? One of the other reasons they targeted children, and the final thing I'll say about this, which occurred to me just very recently, is that children don't develop the ability to reason right from wrong until about the age of 7 years old. Okay? You see, reasoning and morality involve the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate, and the angular gyrus. Okay? These parts of the brain don't develop until about 7 years of age. And at that point, kids naturally start developing reasoning and moral judgments in the world, right? They develop these gifts, these attributes. And what these people realized way back about 160 odd years ago, as I say, in the 1800s, was that if you indoctrinated children at a very early age, and if you indoctrinated them at earlier and earlier ages, then they become easier to manipulate and control. Okay? That's why the system's designed the way it is. This is also why these same sexual repression theories are actually being rolled out in school systems even today. Right? It's why young children in schools today are being sexualized. Young boys are being put onto hormones to make them transgender, following the ideological bent of this transgender agenda. Okay? And why all these things are being championed in a way in which the minds of the young are being destroyed wholesale. Now, understand something here. When I'm talking about the transgender thing, by the way, right? Adults can make their own decisions, okay? And in the human species, you do get that small segment of the population naturally, which is transgender, okay? And that segment of the population usually tends to be about 0.03%. Sometimes a little higher, sometimes a little lower, okay? That's understandable. It's natural variance. But the ideologies which are being pumped out in schools are actually traumatizing children now. I was reading an article about this just last week, where kids were being taught that they had no fixed gender in a certain school. And it caused extreme distress to the children. Because children don't have any sense about these things, right? Particularly when they're below 7 years of age. They just don't know. And when they start being taught garbage, relativistic garbage, it starts traumatizing them. The whole school system is actually designed to cause trauma. at this point in time, and before as well. At this point in time, it is there to do just that. But it always has been. It's just that we've never really seen it taken to these extremes because the populations before would never have accepted it. And parents today shouldn't be accepting this either, quite honestly. Right? And the net result of all this indoctrination is that you get people coming out the other end of these schools, colleges, and universities thinking that they're very clever, thinking that they're very smart. They have this intellectual arrogance when they don't know jack diddly squat about the world around them or themselves. And they become a destructive and malevolent force. Right? That's the thing. That's what this education system is doing, and it does. Because it doesn't promote critical thinking. It was never supposed to. It was only designed to create a willing slave class. Okay? It was designed to create that slave class for those small number of people at the top of the food chain, in elite circles, who wanted to control humanity. All 7.2 billion of us. And the best way they can do that, the best way they figured to do that, was through these programs of social engineering, through the school systems. But that's what is wrong with the education system. That's everything that is wrong with the education system. It's why it is what it is. It was always designed to be this. Okay? Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Take good care of yourselves, and God bless you all.